Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
Do you own a tent?
Bennett.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, no.
I know, I'm with you on that. Why would you? You know, there's
I've got a 10.
I had a 10. I had a 10.
Did you hear that little higher pitch in my voice?
Oh, come on.
Come
on, everyone. Come on, everyone. Let's go camping. Glamping. It's got to be the ugliest word.
It's
the
nasty.
Glamping. Yeah. Which is
Jonathan, surely.
It's not.
He doesn't. They don't do it.
It's not
they don't do it in North
I'm
London.
sorry. I was going to say we don't go outside London for our slang. Well, unless we jump to New York.
I'm hoping we've got a bit of a slang-tastic kind of.
I've got some
stuff.
slang-tastic
Excellent.
info, but it's
Great.
we'll see.
We'll see. On that note, hello and welcome to Backlisted, the podcast that gives new life to old books. As usual, we're gathered around the kitchen table in the luxurious Islington Canalside office of Unbound, the website which brings authors and readers together to make great books. You might hear ducks quack, you might hear kettles boil, but that's the joy of a rich audio environment. I'm John Mitchinson, the publisher of Unbound.
I'm Andy Miller, author of The Year of Reading Dangerously. We're joined, as we always are, by the writer and expert, Matthew Clayton.
Campologist.
The public have had enough of experts, Matthew, but we haven't.
Kind words, Andy, kind words.
And joining us today is Jonathon Green. Jonathon is a writer, historian, survivor, and chronicler of the London 60s hippie underground, and he is the English language's very own slang lexicographer. You can find him on Twitter at Mr_Slang. Is that correct, Jonathon?
That sounds good to me.
All right, good. And for the last 4 decades, Jonathon has been cataloguing, codifying, and communicating the joys of the fruitier side of the English language, leading no less person than former backlisted subject. The person who coined the term Mr. Slang was
Martin Amos. In a very, very, very small footnote.
Yeah.
Okay.
We must take what we can.
We should say that just to amplify that, Jonathon is absolutely is the sole proprietor, owner, compiler, editor of what I, back when we worked together in my Castle days, called the OED of the Street. But Green's Dictionary of Slang is one of the great edifices of modern reference publishing. And if you out there haven't got a copy, you should get one.
And I will add to that if, like me, you are a 60s obsessive,
Yes.
and you read, as I did in 1989, I think I read it.
88, maybe.
I had to
Who's
wait for the
to argue?
paperback.
I got a free one.
A book called Days in the Life, Voices from the English Underground, which is a magnificent, important,
It's superb.
classic book.
Absolutely superb.
You did a few oral histories as well. The oral history of...
I did 6.
oral.
And I did
Was it
Immigrants,
called
which
it?
I would love to do
Do
again now.
Yeah, interesting.
Cannabis, was that an oral history? Or was that
No, that was more a sort of...
personal journey?
Also, we should mention, in distinguishing in passing, Chasing the Sun, a history of lexicography.
Yes, I mean, that's what I mean. I did move on from the 60s.
Also,
Much as I love the 60s.
Also,
but
Jonathon, I met Jonathon when I interviewed him about his book, Odd Job Man.
Oh, yeah.
Odd Job Man is a category we're very fond of here on Backlisted. Biblio-memoir. It is a biblio-memoir, yes.
I think yes, it is.
Didn't you cut your teeth, Jonathan, writing erotica for Fiesta magazine?
I don't think Fiesta really jibes with the word erotica. It was what was known as a top shelf title. It was wonderful. I mean, I was the letters editor of Fiesta for 4 glorious weeks. I'd broken up with a woman who just started the first feminist magazine in the country, Rosie Boycott, and I thought, what can I do? I know, I'll go and work for Fiesta. And we used to get these wonderful... We're not really here talking about this, but we did used to get the most amazing letters. I mean, they say everything's made up. I'm sure the letters were made up, but the letters as letters, written in green ink on lined paper, both sides of the paper, were, I fear, very true. And I could, if you like, expatiate upon this, but perhaps I shouldn't.
Well, we'll see where we get to.
But moving on.
Yeah, you're here to talk to us
Indeed.
about Absolute Beginners by Colin MacInnes. Great London novel, cult novel.
I'm going to state an interest here as well. I consider the whole purpose of Backlisted to have been to get to this point. So watch out, everyone.
So perhaps briefly then, Andy,
Yes,
as is
briefly.
time-honoured fashion, what else have you been reading?
So I have been reading, actually, to tell you the truth, I have mostly been reading books by Colin MacInnes this week.
Have you not read them all already?
Yes, but I hadn't. Well, we'll come on to it. I had read them several times when I was a teenager, and I'd read Absolute Beginners, I guess, on average every 3 or 4 years for the last 30 years. But I hadn't read the other 2 novels in his London trilogy since the 80s. So I went back and read those again. But we'll talk about that in a minute. What I want to talk about is that I was in Paris last weekend.
Oh, wait.
We took my niece to Paris. She's going back to Australia. She's been living here for a year. So we went to Paris for the day, and I was allowed special dispensation while my family went on the Bateau Mouche to leg it to the Palais de Tokyo to go and see the Michel Houellebecq exhibition. Restez vivant, to stay alive.
That's got a corgi.
I'm going to explain all about, on the front of the catalogue, which I brought with me, there's a picture of his late dog, a corgi called Clément.
I bet you're sad you laugh now, aren't you?
Which I'm gonna.
It's got a wonderful moody face.
Yeah.
But this exhibition, anyone who knows the things I write about will know that I'm a big fan of Houellebecq. He is my favourite living writer, for better or worse, which means that I spend my life telling people that Michel Houellebecq is my favourite living writer, and they go, but he's awful. And I say, no, that's interesting because you don't understand him. And we go from there. But I really love his work. I think he is very funny and very pessimistic in a kind of Eeyore-ish way, which I really like. And so anyway, at the Palais de Tokyo, which is, I suppose, the Parisian equivalent of the ICA, isn't it, Jonathan, really?
Something on those lines,
yeah. There's an exhibition that he's curated, I suppose you'd say, about his the things that inform his work or things that he loves. So you pass through a series of rooms that contain, as you would expect from Houellebecq, there's a brilliant computer screen that says, against a black and white background, "Vous n'avez aucune chance." You have no chance. Continuez, and then a button that says "Okay." So, like the Baguette and I can't go on, you'll go on. Okay. And there's a room, because he's fascinated by, for instance, the travel industry, which is one of the things that he wrote about in a novel called Platform. There's a room where the floor is entirely made of postcards. You walk across this horrible selection of postcards that have been laid out to create this awful sense of an infinity of terrible choices available to you as holiday destinations. And then there's another room which you go into where an office has been built in the middle of it. And inside the office is just the most horrible slag heap of books and records and a keyboard and a computer and some Playmobil and a book of erotica. And I was thinking, that looks like my office. So that's brilliant. And then you go into a room of his pornographic photographs. But then you come out into a room devoted to his late dog, Clément. And brilliantly, it's laid out like he lived in Ireland while Clement was alive. He was living in Ireland. It's laid out like an Irish funeral parlour. It has laminated wooden walls and a tartan carpet. It has photos of Clement on the wall. It has a piece of music by Iggy Pop playing about how what is a dog? A dog is a machine for love. And in the middle is a vitrine full of, in chronological order, all Clement's toys from the time he was a puppy until he died. And it is, given in the true Welbeckian fashion, you've been through this series of terrible, filthy, alienated environments, and suddenly you're in this room of actual love. It's incredibly moving. Incredibly moving. And I thought it was wonderful. It won't come to the UK.
But clearly it won't. Why?
Well, first of all, I think it's difficult to move, but also it's clearly been funded by
those crazy French.
But I was thinking, I can think of other British cultural figures who might do it, but I was trying to think of a British author who would do the same thing, who would have an aesthetic that you could represent in different media, and people wouldn't think they were
Meads might be somewhere,
Meads, Jonathon Meads.
I cannot imagine an equivalent in the UK. No. I just cannot imagine it.
No,
you can't imagine.
He also, I won't say a run-in, but I was once 5 or 10 years ago, brought in by the radio, and he was supposed to be talking about his attitude to the 60s, which of course is that I don't like it. Because I'd done Days in the Life, I was dragged in, and we were there, and it was 8 a.m, and I went in, and I was looking around, I thought, who's the tramp sitting over? And he was sort of there, slumped down in the green room. Obviously, well, it seemed to me that he was pissed as a fart at 8 a.m. And what I realise now, and I, in my stupid naivety, and he would not speak English, although I'm sure he can, because he was living in Ireland, and he was giving them a hard time. And I, in my naivety, was trying to help. He must have thought I was mind-numbingly stupid, as indeed I was. You could see that, I can't remember, it wasn't Start of the Week, I can't remember what it was. It was something quite major on BBC, and they could see that the interviewers, sweat running down their faces. Why can't we get something out of him? He's famous. Say something to us. But he said nothing.
He gave an interview a couple of weeks ago to the FT, where he said, in what I sort of think is an emblematically brilliant bit of Welbeck, I simply don't care. He said, I'm the best novelist in the world. That brings certain problems. And the interviewer said, but I said, I'm flabbergasted. And I say, but what about Philip Roth? And Welbeck looks at me and says, no, he's repetitive.
But what does he make of people who the French adore, like David Lodge and Ian McEwan, who they worship? I personally don't like either.
I can't imagine he'd have a huge amount of time for Ian McEwan. Or David Lodge even less.
But you know what? We like McEwan and we like Lodge, but we can't imagine David Lodge curating an exhibition to himself at the ICA, can we? So...
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What percentage of the audience who went to see this exhibition is aware of what an Irish funeral parlour looks like?
But presumably very few. But also, it's worth saying that the audience there were incredibly mixed in terms of ages and genders. That it wasn't, furtive misogynists such as myself. There were people of all colours, creeds and genders there.
In hijabs? No, it's not.
I spent a certain amount of time in Paris. Corgis are not big in France, I don't think. So It's interesting that he should choose a corgi as his love object.
So that's what I was
doing.
see
many of them.
Anyway. I was sort of reading the exhibition. That's what I'm saying. But John, what have you been reading?
Well, I've been reading The Beast, the second in a trilogy of novels by Paul Kingsnorth. Should disclaimer alert and all that we published The Wake, which was longlisted for the Booker and won the Gordon Byrne Prize and shortlisted for various others. And it is an extraordinary book, which everybody remembers because it was written in a kind of a invented language. that was not modern English and not Anglo-Saxon, but a kind of an amalgam of the two, and was remarkable. This is completely different. This is set now, and it's a shorter, much more in a way. There is a sensibility that it shares with the Wake. It's a very uncompromising book, more like a prose poem really than a work of fiction. There's only one character, and you meet this character in a farmhouse or a half derelict farmhouse on what one imagines is Dartmoor, being pelted by rain. It's very unclear exactly what happens, except that there is a terrible accident and he's injured, and he kind of manages to heal himself sufficiently to walk into the edge of the local town. He sees a beast, an animal, sort of beast of large, what turns out to be a large cat, you think, and becomes obsessed with hunting it and finding it. And that is essentially the plot of the novel. Is he goes into town and he comes back again. And I'm not going to tell you whether he finds the beast or not, because insofar as there is a plot in this book, it's that. But it is, I have to say, and the character is called Edward Buckmaster, and those who read The Wake will know that Buckmaster was the main character in The Wake. It's very, very intense, and it's totally in that sort of almost Kafka way of, he just takes this scenario and totally milks it for as much as it can get. And the landscape, insofar again as there are characters, the landscape is a character. The sense of,
is it set in the same place?
No, it's definitely different. You learn more about him through the book. You learn that he's obviously left his wife and child to come and do this. It's not clear what he's doing or why he's doing it, but there is a sort of a sense that he's in some sense a kind of, he's like a hermit. He's gone into the wilderness to fast. I mean, he doesn't eat. He drinks a lot of water. He as I say, he managed to heal himself. I'll give you I'll read one small passage from it.
How does how does it relate to The Wake besides
only in a kind of, you'd have to really know to call it a sequel to The Wake would be misleading for a lot of people who might be expecting.
But he's referring to it as a trilogy, isn't he?
And he's doing, well, the idea is 1,000 years ago, now, 1,000 years hence. That's the plan for the trilogy. Right. And the only real crossover is the name. But there is a kind of a sense of a man dislocated, not feeling part of the modern world, not feeling able to in a way, impotent, not able to, but gains in power, and the presentation of the beast in the book, and the beast is kind of the landscape and is the weather and is and it's as good as anything I've ever read on that. That thing of that the landscape is an outward manifestation of our inner kind of state. He writes. I mean, it's brilliant. It's kind of compelling. I mean, you can't. I'd be. If you don't like very long kind of sentences without much punctuation, it might not be for you. But if you kind of like that sort of slightly messianic strain in literature, it's good. But I'll just read you this bit because I think it
even negging us there, John.
Yes, sorry. It would be impossible for me to guess even how much time passed in this way. This is when he's injured. Every day was the same, and this was simply how it had always been. Every day in the stone room, with the table and chair, with the cupboard and the window, with the white heat outside and around me. I was here and perhaps had always been here, or perhaps had never been here before, but I didn't think much about it. I had my body to think about. I had to rebuild it. I was being born again in the world, retraining my muscles, understanding my pain. So intense and I think pretty remarkable.
Getting very good reviews already, isn't it? I read a review by M. John Harrison in the Guardian, which is a terrific review.
I mean, he's writing in that kind of tradition of it's that sort of almost Blakean kind of visionary prose, I suppose.
I saw a comparison. It wasn't in Mike's review; it was somewhere else. To Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah,
is that?
Yeah, I think there are elements. There are definitely elements. The kind of the road. Kind of end of Cormac McCarthy's oeuvre, maybe. It's not really much. He's not. I mean, he's certainly ploughing his own interesting furrow in English fiction.
Do you know whether he's written all three of them?
No, he hasn't written the third one yet. I do know that.
Right.
But I have to say, it's always The Wake has been so intimately bound up with Unbound. I was kind of slightly trepidatious reading. This is published by Faber and very well published as well, and it's beautifully done. But I have to say it more than exceeded my expectations. So definitely one for that kind of person who likes that kind of book.
Okay, it's time now for an advert.
But now. Come on,
let's go.
I didn't read this book 54 years ago. I finished reading it 20 minutes ago for the first time, which is a huge embarrassment because, it is one of those books which I know everybody really should have read, particularly people who have spent as much time in Soho and love London and jazz and fashion and music as much as I do. But anyway, I hadn't read it, and now I've read it, and guess what?
Two thumbs up.
It's really good. It's brilliant. It is. But I love that thing when you haven't read something and you read it for the first time, and the language is just more. It's just better than you imagine it.
Jonathan, the last episode of Backlister we recorded was with Selena Godden and was about Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby, and we were saying last time this episode is almost like part 2. In a way, because of they're nothing like one another books, but they have cult status, and yet their cult status kind of diminishes them as books. Because what John is saying is what we were saying about Hubert Selby last time, that actually reading Last Exit to Brooklyn, which I never had done, I was thinking, wow, this is great. This isn't good for a cult book. This is the real thing. So, Jonathan, when did you first encounter Absolute Beginners by Colin MacInnes?
I reckon I was 16 because it says 1964, so it's not 54 years. Actually, it's only 52. But I would give anything. I really mean it. And Andy and I have discussed this. Reading it at 16, and I've read it over the years for one reason or another, to gut it for its slang, whatever it might be for my dictionaries. But reading it again at sour old 68, I'd love to recreate the excitement that book brought me, the knowledge it brought me. Now, because I'm sour old 68, I can compare it with other work he did and say, well, he's being a bit didactic here, he's recycling a few pieces he wrote for Encounter, But at the time, it was just eye-opening, it was fantastic. And to cut from the book to my first visit, which would have been a year or so later, to Notting Hill, and walking down into Notting Hill, Portobello particularly, Ladbroke Grove, and thinking, he calls that area Napoli, and walking through there and suddenly going, fuck me, I'm in Napoli. It's heaven. Yeah. And absolutely loving it. And it's just one of those, I mean, when you're that age, you're like a sponge. Well, I think you are. I don't know. Now I'm just sort of dried up, old God knows what. But at that age, one's like a sponge, and they were this amazing input. Ironically, because he never touches them, there were things like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, so on. Still for me, Brecht, whatever. Yeah. But at the time, 64, these things were all flooding into my life. And one of the things that was flooding into my life was Colin MacInnes, and in particular, Absolute Beginners. Again, it was that age when you educated yourself through Penguin books. And although Tony Godwin, who was the great editor of the time, had changed things and put, God help us, pictures on the cover, nonetheless, I think for me, I was still of a generation which had been started off in the 30s, aggrandized in the 40s in the war, because you could put your Penguin book into your battle dress pocket and so on and so forth. We were still educating ourselves very much through Penguins. I was a snotty little bastard. I wouldn't read Pam.
Funnily enough, that's something. I just bought a copy of this book called No Novel Reader by MacInnes, which was published in 74 or 5, near the end of his life. And he talks exactly about that. He talks about the effect of Penguin paperbacks on generations of people who had not been able to reach books. You know, as you say, their kind of autodidactic element to it. It was suddenly, you could do that if you wanted to, in a way that perhaps hadn't been possible before.
The interesting thing with Penguins also were not like their American equivalents from, albeit I think Alan Lane took the idea from America. But I mean, in the specific area of writing about the young, writing about teenagers, I mean, most of the stuff that you'd get in the States in those days was written maybe by Harlan Ellison or by Hal Elson, who was a different person, or by Wendell Brown or by a load of people. But they would always be called things like Jailbait and Switchblade.
They were pulp, right?
They were pulp. They're great. I love them. But nonetheless, MacInnes was completely different.
I will echo what you're saying, Jonathan, in as much as, again, I've written about this at length, but I read Absolute Beginners, as many people my age would have done, in the 80s. I read it in 1984 when I was on holiday in the Western Isles of Scotland with my parents when I was 16.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
I'm sure that was 1974.
I don't know. Well, I know, absolutely. But I remember reading the bit that I just watched Mitch read just now, those last 30 pages. I remember reading those on the deck of a Caledonian McBrain ferry on the way back from Iona to Oban. And the thing is, there's a phrase that I really dislike in the publishing world and in the world, which is that, this book changed my life. And what that normally means is I really like this book. But in the case of Absolute Beginners, this is probably the one or two or three maybe books that changed my life. And I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you about books now had I not read this book. And also in terms of what I felt about politics and what I felt about other races and difference and the potential of being young, all those things which sound a bit like cliches, and yet they were totally true. And so when I come back to this book now, I always come back to it. It probably is my favourite book for sentimental reasons, but I always come back to it with a slight fear that the magic would have gone. And I have to say, reading it last week, I first 30 pages, I was thinking, oh, no, I don't know. But then it got me. Like it always gets me. I think it's unique. It's a unique book. It's flawed, but what it has, the spirit of it, is probably not found anywhere else.
I don't think it changed my life, but I think it broadened it enormously. And maybe that's the same as change. I'm not sure. Going back to the sponge thing, you're just so open, or you should be, and I know I was, to as it were, suggestion. And for me, perhaps the biggest suggestion was books, although rock and roll and so on and so forth were also enormously suggestive, as it were. MacInnes just taught you a lot of stuff. That, I mean, I'd been alive. I'd known that, I was obviously a little bit younger, or maybe a lot younger, when Oswald Mosley was basically winding people up for race riots. And you could still go, when I went to Napoli, as it were, it still said KBW on the walls, keep Britain white. Yeah. All that shit was still there. It was a very different place, Notting Hill, as everybody knows. I always expect when I go there now, which is not very often, that I will be walking down streets paved with gold, but it's still the same old gate, basically. But I don't know. I mean, it's just hard to say. Well, it had an enormous effect. It was just educational, I suppose. And there is that element that runs through the whole of MacInnes's work, which is very didactic. Yeah, and the trouble, I think, is that the wonderful thing is that it's invisible. It's invisible. Like with Dickens, you don't notice, and I'm talking as a slang lexicographer, you don't notice that he's actually read a book about a dictionary of criminal slang, but he puts it into Oliver Twist and you don't see the seams. Again, obviously, MacInnes, particularly with the race riot stuff, had done his research, had taken it on board, so on and so forth, but you don't see the seams. By the time you get to the later books in the trilogy, you do see them too much, and that's why they're not.
If anybody's seen, there's a couple of films that if you want to know sort of what Notting Hill was like, or Napoli was like. No, I was going to mention. There's two films I was going to mention. One of them is 10 Rillington Place. Yeah. If you look at 10 Rillington Place and you see what that area looked like then, but also there's a film. Do you remember a film, Jonathan, called Leo the Last?
I do.
A John Borman
when
film.
I was around. But even more, if you want to, I've always wanted to run a night of London geographical films, and one of them, of course, it would be The Blue Lamp, because the last 5 or 10 minutes of The Blue Lamp, when they have the huge chase, or maybe it's not the last 5. Anyway, there is a 10-minute chunk of The Blue Lamp, which goes, as far as I recall, from Westbourne Park to Ladbroke Grove and so on. In fact, I think all the way through to Shepherd's Bush. And virtually none of that is there. Certainly Westbourne Park, when you realise that the church that's in the middle of Westbourne Park, it was not isolated, but was surrounded by terraces. And those things are wonderful. I mean, and MacInnes does that. I mean, I think one of the things about MacInnes that's incredibly important, because people talk about the teenagers and pop and so on and so forth, which we should get round to. But he is a London novelist. He's a major London novelist.
I think that's what I.
And perhaps that's why he lasts, because he just the bits I love, as I say. The idea, I am in Napoli, he's portrayed it to me, he's shown it to me, and here it is in 3 dimensions, was so exciting.
I think that's the thing, that the 2 things that struck me. One was I'm very, very pleased I hadn't seen the film, the Julian Temple film, so I didn't want to be carrying around the style in my head. You have an idea that it is a kind of it's a sort of Tommy Steele movie, but I
would rather die than see the film.
Yeah, well, that was one thing. The second thing was I was much more interested. What really interested me was the Londonness, for sure. It does make me want to go to Notting Hill and wander. It does make me want to go to Soho. Indeed. But the language, the dialogue in particular, I think is really it's arresting and not in a kind of hey daddy-o kind of way. I mean, there's a really it's just really I found myself reading and rereading passages from it and marking them and just thinking, it's a proper literary novel.
So shall I just give the synopsis before you read a bit? So I'm going to read I'm going to read the blurb on the back of the Penguin edition from 1965 with the Peter Blake cover. It says, our guide on this conducted tour of London's teenage subgroups is an astonishingly, sparklingly articulate 18-year-old photographer. He's actually 19, everyone. Street, holiday, park, studio, artistic poses, and when I can find a client, pornographic, with a riotous line in espresso patter. From Belgravia to Shepherd's Bush, we drift with him among a colourful set of contacts and cronies. Crep Suzette, his spade-crazy 17-year-old chick, Edward the Ted, the homosexual hoplite, Zesty Boy Sift, the pop songwriter, in a hilarious round of the jazz dives, drinking clubs and parties of all kinds where this under-20 underworld hangs out. Climax of this modern mayhew comes when our likeable guide gets involved in the Notting Hill's race riots with an unexpected result. That's not a very good blurb, is it? That doesn't do justice to this book at all. What fascinates me, though, is that, of course, that I would have read age 16, because I'm sure you've gone through that, I'm sure everybody has. Why did I pick this book up? Why did I go up to the counter of wherever it was and offer 3 and 6pence, which would have been a lot to me in those days, still is, and read this? I mean, it's so bad. And they cannot even get Ed the Ted right. He has to be Edward the Ted. And you wonder if it was some nice young boy who'd just come down from Oxford, and it was, you do this. I don't know. The word John...
And Allsop's review is embarrassing as well, which he talks about. It's a real gasser. I mean, the thing about the language, if I may, tout my slang hat for a while, is that it's very good. He makes up you look at I'm talking about the slang. And the slang he uses, he uses about 200 words in it, it's right. That's the point. It's right. He makes up a few things, I think. I mean, I've never found right at the beginning he uses the word Felix to mean penis, and he talks about it in the context of skyscrapers and tower blocks, I think he's talking about, and he talks about Felixes rising to the clouds, cloud kisses and so on, and I think that was him having fun, maybe, but most of what he uses is very much from
I read that differently. See, I think that's on the first page, right?
Yeah, it is.
And the line says,
prove me wrong.
I'm just like these. Yeah. Like Cinerama, you can see clean new concrete cloud kissers rising up like Felixes from the old Englishy squares. See, I thought what I read that as, and what I've always read that as, is he's getting the word phoenix wrong.
Yeah.
I thought
That he
as well.
thinks he knows it all, which is a big part of the character of the narrator.
When your
He's
life
getting it a
is
bit wrong.
dedicated to collecting 1,400 synonyms for the word penis and many other things, I'm afraid it becomes very narrow once. But I think that's how I saw it in 1964.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Maybe it's a combo. I don't know. And when I think zip, when he uses about zips, when I think he's talking about drugs or is it drink, I can't remember. He talks about zips, and he's talking about by which he means sips, small quantities. As far as I know, that doesn't exist anywhere else. There's a few like that. This isn't to put. And there's one or two things I can't. There's one word that he puts in there, and this is me being so pedantic. He uses the word wrought to mean upset, which is hugely common in Australia and completely non-existent as far as I'm aware in the UK at the time.
And we should say that he was brought up in Australia.
Yes, that seems very... He's a voyeur, is he not? And that's an enormous... Not only is he didactic, he's also, I think, teaching himself. And he's telling us what he's learning. And the excerpt from Horace Ove that I quite like.
We'll get to that in a minute.
Is saying that.
Just on the Felix thing, it just made me think, because I just read the last. Right. There's a great little bit where he gets a lift at the end by Mickey Ponderosa, and Mickey didn't seem to approve of this, although I thought the cat might be flattered. He said, I thought the cat might be flattered, meaning him. He said once, a Roman always a Roman. And in every country, there were horrors as well as felicities. That was the word he used. I just thought that sort of Felix of felicity is not a word you get.
John and Jonathan were both talking about London. This is a book about London.
Yeah.
I just want to read one paragraph which I think illustrates how MacInnes writes about London, but they also illustrate something else that I just want to bring attention to because I love it so much in this book. This is like in the first section. So I went out of the Dubious, which is a drinking.
I'm just about to.
club.
I had exactly the same passage.
There you go.
It's such a.
So I went out of the Dubious to catch the summer evening breeze. The night was glorious out there. The air was sweet as a cool bath. The stars were peeping nosily beyond the neons, and the citizens of the Queendom, in their jeans and separates, were floating down the Shaftesbury Avenue canals like gondolas. Everyone had loot to spend. Everyone a bath with verbena salts behind them, and nobody had broken hearts because they were all ripe for the easy summer evening. The rubber plants in the espressos had been dusted, and the smooth white lights of the new-style Chinese restaurant, not the old mahjong categories, but the latest thing, with broad glass fronts and Dacron curtainings, and a beige carpet over the interiors, were shining a dazzle like some monster telescreens. Even those horrible old Anglo-Saxon public houses, all potato crisps and flat stale ale and puddles on the counter bar and spittle, look quite alluring, provided you didn't push those 2-ton doors that pinch your arse and wander in. In fact, the capital was a night horse dream. And I thought, my lord, one thing is certain, and that's that they'll make musicals one day about the glamour-studded 1950s. And I thought, my heaven, one thing is certain too, I'm miserable. Oh. I mean, first of all, so that's beautiful, right? But the second thing to say about it, and the thing that Jonathan and I were talking about this week, for me, the reason why this book why it spoke to me then and it still works now, is it captures that adolescent mixture of front and vulnerability better than any other book I can think of, bar none. That there's that sense of the guy who's got all the answers, but at some level saying, please, someone hug me, is so powerful. The analogy that I mean, it's coincidentally, it's a mod thing, but the analogy, the thing it most reminds me of is Quadrophenia. Yeah. Because it's a similar kind of Jimmy in Quadrophenia in whichever version you care to take. But Jimmy in Quadrophenia is that fantastic mixture of Street Fighter and kid having a nervous breakdown. Incredibly vulnerable, but with all the chat. And that, to me, seems to be the thing that in Absolute Beginners... You know, Jonathan, we were saying MacInnes is probably not a great novelist, though this is a great novel. And I almost feel with Absolute Beginners that there's some happy, almost accidental coming together of his talents, vernacular, timing, that lead him to produce this amazing book, which is not quite,
Not conscious.
Yeah.
I don't think that, because he's born in 1914, so we're talking about somebody who's no longer a baby, almost as old as me. But he's and there's certain elements in which, as we say, he's a voyeur. He wants to teach us stuff, but somehow it all comes together in Absolute Beginners. And as you say, it worked for you in the 80s. It works for John now, and it certainly worked for me back then. But I don't think he knew quite what he was doing, because you can be very cynical and say, well, he did the bits, as I said before, he did the bits on pop stars and so on and so forth, and on the way, and teenagers, and on there's one called Sharp Schmutter about clothes, all for Encounter in the late 50s, very early 60s, and you can see they're being brought together in certain ways, but again, not obviously to create certain areas of Absolute Beginners, to create the atmosphere, not the dialogue, but the atmosphere. But he transcends it. He manages to transcend it. And the fact that the three of us, reading it at different times initially, still find it a fascinating book is a huge tick, as it were. I should have a better word, but it's an enormous encomium, to go to the other end of the vocabulary, that he managed to do this. And he doesn't do it in the others. Unfortunately, he doesn't. And when you move outside the trilogy, I tried to read other stuff, and I didn't enjoy that.
Also, the thing about MacInnes as a novelist, to his credit, is that even within these three London novels, City of Spades, Absolute Beginners, Mr. Love and Justice, he's not trying to write the same book every time. He's trying to write a different kind of novel every time, unfortunately, with mixed results, because either he doesn't have this kind of lucky thing to access, or else the setting doesn't quite match the subject.
He's trying too hard, dare I say. The other book I think is worth mentioning is Crust on Its Uppers.
By Derek Rayner.
By Derek Rayner, in fact, by Robin Cook. And the Crust on Its Upper, I mean, there are very few, I'd almost say no books about the 60s, and I raise my fingers at that point in quotes, because one of the things, we didn't do that. I mean, what people wrote was manifestos or newspapers or rock and roll lyrics or films that never got made or whatever it might be. But actual novels, you waited for a while the grown-ups were doing it. Evelyn Waugh was still knocking stuff out. Kingsley Amis was still knocking out whoever it might be. The likes of me look to America anyway. But the two books that actually, they're both really late 50s books, but they segue into the 60s, and the one is Absolute Beginners, and the other is the Chelsea set book, which is Crust on Its Uppers. And there's a character in Absolute Beginners called the ex-Deb of last year, and you can see that's the world she comes from, and it's a very different world. But there's no way that I, as a 16-year-old, could have related to that at all. Jonathan Meades turned me on to it, but much, much later. And it's a fascinating book. It's a wonderful book, but it hasn't got the feel for the world in the same way at all.
I just wanted to say something though about the narrator in the book, that English Holden Caulfield type of narrator. But it's incredibly honest. It's very difficult with cult books because it's so connected in most people's minds. This book with the coffee bar culture, with I guess the proto mod. He's brilliant on clothes, on dress sizes, on fashion, very, very detailed accounts of the clothes that people are wearing. But there's one passage I like, this Deb of last year says, about being honest about the teenage experience. And I really like this, but he said, she held my arm and said, "Tell me a secret about you teenagers. Do you have a very active sex existence?" Which is a pretty good question. And then, "They can't keep off it." "No," I replied, "we don't." And as a matter of fact, what I said was true, because although you often see teenagers boxed up together in a free and easy, intimate sort of way, it doesn't very often reach the point of no return. But in the kingdom we reside in, the firm belief of the venerable seems to be that if you see kids out and about enjoying themselves, then fleshy vices must be at the bottom of it all, somewhere, not just as it often is, frisking and frolicking and having a carefree ball, which I felt was an authentic insight, and that's what I remember. What teenagers are always assumed to be, shagging each other's senses. Actually, the truth is that they're dressing up, having fun, and not hoping for the best.
Before we say anything more, I just want to do the little potted biography of MacInnes, because then we can talk a bit about how he came to write this particular book. So he was born in 1914, died age 61 on the 22nd of April 1976. He was the son of the singer James Campbell MacInnes and the novelist Angela Thirkell. He was the great-grandson of the pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones. He? Yeah.
That's quite
He was the cousin...
That's a tenuous link that you missed there.
He was the cousin of Rudyard Kipling and Stanley Baldwin.
Yeah.
Establishment literature.
When he was a boy, the family decamped from... they lived in Kensington, then they moved to Australia. He grew up in Melbourne, only returning to England in his teens. So he's like a really interesting mixture of... This is what Tony Gould says in the biography. He's like a mixture of Edwardian intelligentsia, Australia in the 1920s, and London's post-war bohemia, and he habitually described himself, MacInnes habitually described himself as, quote, an English, London-born, Australian-reared Scot. And fundamentally, he was a journalist and a radio pundit. He used to appear on Today, or the equivalent thereof. He used to appear on a programme called The Critics regularly. He wrote 1,500 radio scripts for the BBC. He hacked them out.
So how old was he when Absolute Beginners came out?
Mid-40s. And he's the author of 7 novels, the first of which is To the Victor the Spoils, which was published in 1950, the last of which is Out of the Garden in 1974. And he also wrote a very successful book of essays called England Half English, which was published in 1961. I found a wonderful phrase to describe MacInnes. This biography is called Inside Outsider. And MacInnes never really fitted anywhere. And he's described in the biography by several people as, quote, the rudest man I have ever met.
Did he like a drink?
He very much enjoyed a drink. But also as a wonderful description of someone who knew him for a long time and was friendly with him, who said that MacInnes was someone who had been borrowed from death. That he was the saddest and loneliest man that I ever met.
Yeah.
He was always had his face pressed up to the window, was always looking to belong while simultaneously telling everybody to piss off.
I mean, it is quite a sad novel.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to give the ending away, but the ending is very bittersweet. Jonathan, you were going to say?
I was just thinking though, the counterculture. When you start going back to it, and it's a little bit later than all of this, obviously, a decade later, maybe, well, a little less, but 7 or 8 years, but it was actually powered by not exactly people like MacInnes, but it was powered by Australians and by Americans. It was powered by outsiders. And in a way, he fits in that because they want to know. They want to know in a way much more than those of us who already think we know. And that was very much true. And it was one of the things I noticed when I was doing Days in the Life, the oral history of all this stuff, is how many people, the real movers and shakers, and the obvious one being someone like Richard Neville or Germaine Greer, people of that nature, they'd not started off in the UK, and they were telling us about what we were doing. Richard was certainly that. He was a very good editor. An Oz magazine, which he ran, which I think MacInnes might have written a couple of pieces
He did,
for.
yeah, he did.
And MacInnes was of that type. There's also obviously a strong streak of George Orwell there, particularly in essays like the Express, the Daily Express families.
Yes, which he says, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He fronts up. He doesn't pretend it's not the case. Not, dare I say, I mean, and because it's sub-Orwell, it's really in the end rather thin. But that's by the by. It's when he's telling us stuff that we haven't noticed. It's when he's explaining stuff. Well, I say we. This is when, for 16-year-old people. One of the things I'm wondering, though, I've been trying to look up what the reviews were like back then. And I must admit, having looked through newspaper databases, I can't find
Well,
any.
I must say,
Not many.
somebody on Twitter told me to go and look at You Never Had It So Good, or Never Had It So Good by Dominic Sandbrook.
Oh, yeah.
Because, first of all, it contains some of the reviews of the book, and they are mixed, but mixed in the true sense, rather than mixed meaning bad. They are genuinely...
Some good,
some bad. But also Dominic Sambrook really gives Absolute Beginners a pasting, and he says he describes it as like a pale copy of Catcher in the Rye.
Right, yeah.
And you know what? Dominic Sambrook, I hope you hear this.
Doesn't like me either.
You didn't get it. You didn't get it.
No, but I don't think
get it, but you
Dominic
still had to
Sambrook
write
gets
something.
the era, dare I say.
I mean, I know
That's my opinion.
I did mention Holden Caulfield earlier, but it's not like Catcher in the Rye at all.
I don't think
You know
it's
what?
remotely
Catcher in the
like
Rye.
Catcher in
The
the
thing about Catcher in the Rye is Catcher in the Rye is a great book. I'm not going to start going,
Yeah.
it's no good. It's a great book.
Yeah, it is.
But the things that make it a great book are, for the most part, orthodox and literary. The things that make Absolute Beginners a great book is that it plugs into all these other traditions which Salinger could never get within a million miles of, because it's not his world. Jonathan, you brought something with you which I'm keen to get in.
What was that?
Well, you said you had a
thing?
little thing about MacInnes, which you had interviewed Horace Ove.
Yeah, Horace Ove was in, I suppose, Michael de Freitas, later Michael X's entourage, and part of the English Black Power movement. And he, as this piece explains, was the person who took the photos for the cover of Absolute Beginners, and indeed on your I'd never seen that picture before. It's wonderful. Much better, dare I say, than the cover of Absolute Beginners, which is a strange
It's an
picture.
omnibus edition, which was published in '69, called Visions of
By
London.
the great McGibbon and Key.
I mean, this was an interview I did with Horace, who was by then, I think, teaching at Goldsmiths in 1987. And it goes like this. Colin MacInnes was an angry white man, angry with his world, his own class, angry about the way the white working class were treated in this country, angry about the way blacks were treated in this country. And he wanted to do something, and he wanted to expose himself to it. Actually, he was one of the only writers I can't think of any others, even today, that wanted to write about black people, live among black people, get beaten up by black people, sleep with black people, eat with them, and wrote about them. And he understood them because he exposed them himself in the most dangerous situations to find out. And as a parenthesis, Horace is obviously talking more about City of Spades than he, in the context of than Absolute Beginners. And he did understand black people, but his only fault that he was pushing too hard. He was angrier than the black people he talked to. So although black people got involved with Colin and understood him and he helped a lot, they were a bit scared of him in a way, because he would get very upset if he didn't understand what was going on and what you should do with it. He was the only person who wrote an interesting article about Michael X after everybody else had condemned him. I found him very interesting because I got very friendly with Colin. I first met him in a room with several other people, and I didn't know who the hell he was. And he was talking about cannibalism in the Caribbean and how the Caribs ate people. And I didn't know who he was. And I said, "You're talking bullshit, man. There's no cannibalism in the Caribbean." And he said, "Don't you tell me that. What do you know about it?" "I'm telling you there is." And I said, "No." And we had a heated argument. What he didn't realise was that before coming to the UK, I'd been working with a paleontologist, working with a very old German anthropologist who'd spent 30-something years trying to find out whether there was any cannibalism in the Caribbean. And he discovered that there wasn't any fucking cannibalism. And it was some kind of folklore. They could have been just eating monkeys. But Colin had this naive attitude. He couldn't believe this, and he wouldn't believe it. And after the argument, he said, "Well, I like that. I like it when someone attacks me." And that's what he loved. He wanted someone to fight back. And I got to know him, and he took me into McGibbon and Key and demanded that I did some of his book covers. So I did Absolute Beginners and the others.
I mean,
That's great.
I feel I should also add that in terms of, certainly in City of Spades, some of the language that's used probably hasn't worn very well, is very of its time.
Jumble being an obvious word, which I've never found in any other context.
You know, that criticism that we were talking about, you know, his attitudes are colonial is probably one way of putting it, and yet he's trying to do something in an era where there was no
This is what it comes down
language
to.
for
This is
it.
what we discussed. This is, in the end, you can say this wasn't quite right and that wasn't quite right, and it's too didactic and it's too voyeuristic and so on. But he did it. And the one thing I did experience, which, with respect to you all, and no one else would have been there, was that it was the first time anybody had done it for us in the UK, in London at the time, and that was remarkable.
Yeah.
For that, I am in his debt forever.
and I'm in his debt forever for writing a book that apparently in my state of arrested adolescence, I can never quite get away from.
I'm going to give it to my 18-year-old when I get home, because I think he'd absolutely love it. And I sort of think it is a good book for teenagers to read. I wish I'd read it when I was a teenager.
The number of people, fascinatingly, I've been talking about my book, or people will often ask me, what's your favourite book, or what's a book that would get people reading? I often mention Absolute Beginners, and fascinatingly, John, you said it when we started, well, everybody knows this book. Sort of, you know what? This book is being forgotten.
Yeah.
That's it. It is in the process of passing into history. That how few people have heard of it. It's partly because of the film, because the film killed the book. But also, I guess, and the number of people who've read it, not everyone has read it and loved it. I won't, make a false claim there. But many have. And many people have said to me, this should be on the curriculum. This is a book that's dealing with things, albeit in ways that are worth discussing from a historical perspective, but things that are happening in the UK now.
On the wrong side of the political correctness divide. I wonder if that's
Perhaps.
slightly that it just is a little bit too kind of lively to.
I don't know. I don't do PC. Slang doesn't do PC.
Praise the Lord.
I can't. I don't know. I mean, as I say, it wasn't a problem I had to come up against at the time. Whether it would now be consigned to the grim ranks of young adults, I hate to think. I hope not.
It's too good for
I
that.
hope not.
Hey, Matthew,
Yeah.
Hey, Andy.
do you have any yet more tenuous links?
Yes, I've got one
this book?
I've got one to
Or
finish this off on.
Tenebros links. I mean,
Tenebros links. So I've got a link, in fact, to a previous podcast of ours.
Wow.
Which is a bit meta.
That is self-referential. Yeah.
So in a previous podcast we did, Andrew Mel came in and talked about Raymond Chandler's
High Window, yes, that's right,
High Window. And I was delighted that there was a line in High Window about Pink-Headed Bug that the Leeds art punk band, the Three Johns, had turned into a single. And I was delighted to read Absolute Beginners because on about page 10, Colin talks about teenagers going to record shops, and he uses the phrase teenage nightingales to wax, which remarkably the Three Johns also stole and turned into a song.
Wow.
Having now got my taste for MacInnes, should I read the trilogy? Should I read City of Spades next?
City of Spades, yes. Whether you read Mr. Love and Justice, you should read it because you're a completist, I'm sure, and it's necessary. But you'll get, I fear, more and more cross.
Right.
They're fascinating.
Yeah.
But you know so much. I mean, there's stuff in, for instance, Mr. Love and Justice, which at the time was fascinating because forget the pimp-whore relationship. Just talking about places in the East End which were only black sailors were going there and so on and so forth. That doesn't exist anymore. We're back to the London thing. And on the London level, those books are very good. They are not absolute beginners. For me, they're too didactic.
Yeah.
But
I'm the same way. I agree with Jonathan. I mean, I think City of Spades is well worth reading, and England Half English is actually worth reading in terms of his essays. Not all, but some of them are absolutely terrific.
Correct.
I was, you were talking about the Three Johns, Matthew. This book has given me so much, right? And I read it because I like the Jam. And the Jam had
song.
a single called Absolute Beginners, right? That's why I read it. 1981. And there's a lyric in Absolute Beginners, again, when I was 13, didn't mean so much to me. It's got the lyric, it's like Weller is trying to find the essence of the book.
This is from Welbeck to Weller, isn't it?
Welbeck to Weller, that's my next book. And so the other way around, Weller to Welbeck. And he's trying to find the essence of the book. There's just these two brilliant lines. I need the strength to go and get what I want. I lost a lifetime thinking of it.
Yeah.
It's that brilliant mixture of front and regret.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that's so powerful in this book for me.
Can I ask you one last question, Jonathan? Was it one of the books that, I mean, your later career as a slang lexicographer, when you were reading it as a 16-year-old, was it the language that kind of that stayed with you?
Not in this particular book. No. I would love to think that I was this sort of micro slang lexicographer, but actually I wasn't that bad.
Well, I think on that brilliant note, shall we end it? Thanks to Jonathan to Matthew Clayton, as ever, to producer Matt Hall, and thanks once again to our sponsors Unbound. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at BacklistedPod, on Facebook, facebook.com/backlistedpod, and on our page on the Unbound site at unbound.co.uk/backlisted. And if you
use the extraordinary antiquated system known as iTunes to listen to Backlisted, we'd be grateful if you could rate us or leave a review, or it all helps us spread the word. Ever so humble, yeah.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another show in a fortnight. Until then, good night.
Thanks, everyone.
If you prefer to listen to Backlisted without adverts, you can sign up to our Patreon. It's www.patreon.com/backlisted. As well as getting the show early, you get a whole 2 extra episodes of what we call Locklisted, which is Andy, me, and Nikki talking about the books, music, and films we've enjoyed in the previous fortnight.